All right, good. So what we're going to do today is we're going to get started on this. Were you able to make copies of the worksheet that I sent you?
Yes.
Everybody's got printed copies of that. Excellent, good. We're going to see how things go. Pop is still not sure exactly what to expect or how things are going to progress, but we'll see, okay? So tell me what you do know about the Book of Concord. Okay, Oliver?
The Book of Concord is where people recorded Martin Luther's sermons.
Okay, there are some sermons in here, but that's only one small part, but you're on the right track. And Martin Luther is a big part of this. It's good. Hadley?
There's explanations for more of the commandments more clearly.
Okay, the commandments are explained more clearly. That's part of it too. Good. Titus?
It explains worship service.
Okay, it explains what worship should be. There's a teeny part of that, but not a lot, but it definitely shapes a lot of worship things. That's a good guess. Jude, you want to take a crack at it?
I'm thinking.
Okay. You guys have all heard of the Book of Concord, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Now that great big fat one that you've got in front of you with the blue cover says on the cover, you read, it says the Book of Concord, the Confessions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. So let's just start with that. What does Concord mean? You heard that word before, Oliver?
Together?
Yeah, together. Okay. It actually comes from a Latin word, which is, go ahead, Hadley.
I was gonna guess Concord grapes.
Concord grapes. Yeah, Concord grapes are named for a place, okay? And Concord is kind of a popular name, but it's an old word and it comes from a Latin root. And it comes from the Latin root cor, which means heart, okay? C-O-R, cor is heart. And C-O-N, put in front of a word, means with. And so concord means with heart, with heart together. We're together in our thinking, we're together in our beliefs, we're together in our convictions. So concord means to be together with somebody, to be in concord, has harmony, to be together. So the Book of Concord means we're now all together, we have harmony, we agree. And so this is a book that contains agreements among people who believe in Jesus. So it's a book of agreement. And so the seminary I teach at is called
Concordia Seminary.
Right. And so Concord, means the same thing, harmony, together. So Concordia. And so Concordia is a very popular word in the Lutheran Church, in the Missouri Synod. We use it for a lot of things because it expresses this idea of harmony and togetherness, that we are together in what we confess. Okay? So the Book of Concord, you know what that means. What's a confession? What's that mean? Yeah, go ahead, Titus.
It's what we believe.
All right, what we believe, that's good. Okay, go ahead, Hadley.
It's something that it's when you say, when you confess what you believe.
All right, when you confess what you believe. Good. And so confess literally means to say the same thing as, and that's a Latin root. It comes from an older Greek word, which is homologeo, which is the same thing, which means to say the same thing as. So when we confess, we are speaking together the same thing. You got a question, Jude or Titus?
Yes. How do you spell that Latin word?
The Latin or the Greek? The Greek is homologeo, which in English should be HOMOLOGEO. Homologeo.
Okay.
Okay. And in Greek it would be omicron mu, omicron lambda, omicron gamma, iota alpha. Homologeo, epsilon omega. So the worksheet that you have will give you some direction, but there's going to be times when you're going to ask a question and I might start talking about something. You think, oh, that's important, but there's nowhere to write it down on the worksheet. So you just flip it over and put it on the back side or on an extra piece of paper. Okay.
Okay.
That will happen a lot when you'll hear people lecture for the rest of your life. Is sometimes the plan isn't always followed. Sometimes something different comes up, but it's important. So you just find a place to write about that too. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so we haven't even gotten to the worksheet yet. We're still just working through this. And sometimes when I'm teaching, I have an idea I didn't think of before, like, I think it'd be good to talk about the title page. Let's do that. So that's what I'm doing, okay? So I just had this idea. So confessions, we know what that means. Then it says the confessions of the evangelical. All right, what does evangelical mean? Go ahead, Hadley.
Together.
Together, that's kind of Concord. Evangelical is, there's togetherness to this, but it has a different meaning. Titus?
Does it mean like Lutheran?
Does it mean like Lutheran? Kind of, all right? So, but you see, next word, go ahead, Hadley.
I hear Evangelical Lutheran Church. So
That's
it could
right, it
be
says
like
Evangelical Lutheran.
Church.
That's right. So it's not exactly the same thing. All right. So what evangelical means is it comes from an old Greek word too. Okay. And this time the Greek word is euangelion, which means good news or gospel, because gospel and good news and euangelion all mean the same thing. And so evangel, it's the first part of the word. Evangel means gospel, the good news. So evangelical means the good news preaching church, okay? Or in other words, the gospel church. And so the gospel is what's being emphasized there. So to say something we as evangelical means gospel centered. So the confessions of the gospel centered Lutheran church. And what does Lutheran mean?
Luther something.
Yeah, we're following the teachings of Luther. We're following the ideas that Luther helped to make clear again. But it's important to remember here also that we don't believe that we're following Luther. Who are we really following?
Jesus.
Jesus. That's exactly right. Go ahead, Hadley.
When we say we're following Jesus, does that mean that we're following every single thing he's teaching?
Well, if Jesus said it, we try to follow it. Exactly right. Because we're sinful people, we don't always do it perfectly. But if Jesus said it, that's the end of the discussion. Luther's not Jesus. And so Luther said some things. Sometimes we say, maybe not. But what we do like about Luther is when he very carefully expressed and carefully taught the teachings of the church the right way, the teachings of Jesus. And so when we say we're Lutheran, it's not because we think Luther's so great, even though he was. It's because we think Luther helped fix some things that were messed up. And we'll talk more about that in the weeks to come when we get especially to the Augsburg Confession. Not today, probably not even next week, but we'll get there eventually. Okay?
Okay.
So, all right. So that's the title page of this book. Now, the other thing you need to know about this book is this is one particular version of the Book of Concord. All right. The oldest version, or the more original one, is this one. Okay. And on the spine, you can read the title. It's the Bekenntnisschriften. And so that's German. And what that means is the Confessions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church. It's the same thing it is on our book cover in English. So this is German. The Bekenntnisschriften der Evangelische Lutherische Kirche. And so this is the Book of Concord in the original languages. And so this is like the authoritative version because it's all in the original languages. But since you guys don't know much German or Latin yet, and my German and Latin is not that great, I like using the English a lot. And so the English translation we have is this one, the Book of Concord. And the translation you guys have is was done by a whole group of guys who got together and did the translation. Some of them are people I know who work here at Concordia Seminary with me and teach with me. Dr. Aaron was one of them. Dr. Kolb was one of them. Then there were some other people in other seminaries and universities. And the two main people who worked on this book, making sure it was translated the right way and the translation was carefully done, because translation matters a lot. Because if the translation isn't following the original words carefully, everybody's going to get confused. So translations matter. So the men who were overseeing the translation were two people, and that was Robert Kolb and Timothy Wengert. That's W-E-N-G-E-R-T if you care. Timothy Wengert. You'll see his name on the title page of the book. They were the two main editors. And so that's why we call this edition of the Book of Concord, we call it Kolb Wengert, or KW. And if you look in your book, go ahead and open the first page and go past the blank page. Then there's one page that says the Book of Concord. Open past that one. Then you get to the real live title page. You got it right there. See it?
Yes.
Looks like this. Yep, you got it. Look at the names. It says edited by Robert Kolb and Timothy Wengert. Translated by, then there's all the names: Aaron, Gritch, Kolb, Russell, Schaff, Stroll, and Wengert. So those were all the translators, okay? Then at the very bottom of that title page, you can see that it was published by Fortress Press, and the city it was published in was Minneapolis, okay? See how that works?
Yes.
Now turn the page again, and there's all this little teeny print, and you'll see on the third line down, it says copyright 2000. And so that means this book was released in 2000, the year 2000, before any of you were born. Okay, go ahead, Jude.
Just a sec. Why does it have a little asterisk on James Schaff's name?
Yeah, I would have to look and see on that. I'm sure it's in here somewhere, and I should remember. It's probably because maybe he was not able to finish what he was doing, or maybe he was just contributing in some special way. I would have to look and do a little more research on that. That's a good question. Go ahead, Hadley.
Did they have it copyrighted in 2000, so it was a memorable date?
No, that's just when they got it done. When a book gets done, it gets sent to the publisher. The publisher does all the final editing, and that takes months and months and months, and then it gets finally published. If you'll notice, there's a little foreword to this edition, and that's on page 10 in Roman numerals, page X. Okay, you notice who signs it: Robert Kolb in St. Louis, Timothy Wengert in Philadelphia, and they wrote their foreword on the eve of the conversion of St. Paul in 1999. And so they wrote they were done with their work in 99, but it didn't get published until 2000. Sometimes it takes a while to get everything all done and out. Okay.
Okay.
Is that making sense?
Yes.
That makes sense.
All right. So that's the Book of Concord. So this one has been around for 23 years now, but this is one of the newer translations and one of the better ones. We use it at the seminary all the time. That's why I have you guys using it. There are other ones around too. When I was going to the seminary to become a pastor, we didn't have this one yet, because I graduated in 1987, 13 years before this one was done. And the one we used was called by a man named Tappert, and that was called the Tappert edition. And so we use that one all the time. Now we're using this one. Okay. Now, the Book of Concord is actually a very interesting book because it's actually a collection of many documents. All right. And the Book of Concord, here's your first fill in the blank, actually contains 10 documents.
Oh, wow.
Okay. So
That's
the Book
a
of
lot.
Concord has, yeah, it is a lot. It has 10 documents in here. This particular translation, or sometimes it's called edition, which means it's another one of the releases of the versions of the book. Edition is kind of like version, has 774 pages. So it's a big monster book, but it's really got 10 books inside it. So if each one was, 100 pages or 770 pages, then we'd have 10, 700 to be about right. They're not all the same length. Some are short, some are long. Go ahead, Hadley.
I was just wondering that why does it have 10 separate little books? Couldn't they just all combine it into one?
There's a reason for that. It's all combined as one book now called the Book of Concord. But the Book of Concord is really 10 documents, and I'm going to call them documents because they're very different in length or even the way they're written. So there are 10 different documents that are in the Book of Concord, and there are even more things in those 10. There are different prefaces and introductions, and there's sometimes lists of names of people who signed it, and we'll talk about all those things when we get there, but there are 10 documents. All right, so when was this book, the Book of Concord, written? That's your next line. The oldest document was written in about 325 AD. 325 AD. That was a long time ago. Almost 1,700 years ago, 1,700 years ago. That's a long time ago. So 325 AD. And what does AD mean? Go ahead, Titus.
In the year of our Lord, Anno Domini.
Yes, it's two Latin words, Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. And so that means that when Jesus was born, that started 0. There were some mistakes probably made. So Jesus is probably born in 5 BC, but that's a topic for another time. But anyway, in 325, the first document was written. And we'll talk about the oldest one in a minute. And the newest document in the Book of Concord was written in 1577. 1577, which is 350 years ago, about. So, or I'm sorry, 450 years ago. So that was a long time ago. All right. Nothing new has been added for over 400 years, almost 500 years. Nothing more has been added to the Book of Concord. So it's
Wow.
been unchanged for a long time. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So that's a long time, though, between 325 and 1550 or 1577. It's a long time. All right. So that's the kind of the time span. They were written, and here are the languages. They were written in 3 different languages. They were written in Greek and in Latin and in German. So we got Greek, Latin, and German. The Greek is very, very small. Only a couple parts were done in Greek, and we'll talk about those today. And the Latin is just about most of it, because Latin, especially in the Middle Ages and in Luther's day, that was the language that people all did theology in, because it didn't matter what language you were speaking. Maybe you were German or French or Italian or Spanish. You had all these different languages, but everybody in the church knew Latin. And so they would all do their work in Latin. In fact, when you would go and hear Martin Luther lecture, he wouldn't lecture in German, he would lecture in Latin. And so that was the language of the university and the language of learning. Go ahead, Hadley.
Because Latin is like the language that the church started it.
Well, the church didn't start it, but the church definitely used it and even changed it a little bit. Latin was the language of the Romans. So the Roman Empire, way back, even before Jesus was born. So the Roman Empire came into shape. And so even before the Old Testament was finished, Latin was around. So it's the language of the Roman Empire. So they didn't speak Roman, they spoke Latin. All right. And Latin was the language of Rome. So that's why when Rome conquered the world, even before Jesus was born, Latin just spread everywhere and it became the language. And so when the Christian church started, first it started with Greek being the main language people would speak, but then eventually Latin kind of became the language everybody spoke. And Latin has been the language of the church ever since the church was started. And in some places, they still use Latin. Roman Catholics will still produce documents sometimes in Latin. They do that still to this day, even though there aren't very many people speaking Latin anymore to each other. Jude.
Why did the church not use Latin anymore?
Mostly because the language died out when Roman Empire died out. So no one speaks Latin anywhere in the world anymore, except maybe in the Vatican sometimes. In Rome, now they speak Italian, and Italian is sort of like a modern form of Latin. And in fact, a lot of languages have kind of roots and connections to Latin. They're very similar in style. We call them Romance languages because they have connections to Rome and to the Roman way of doing things. So French and Spanish and Portuguese all have connections to the Romance language, to Latin. Okay, Hadley?
We're learning about Latin, and we have learned that Latin is really the thing that a lot of the languages go off of,
Yep.
and there is many words that are super similar to Latin words.
That's right. We call those cognates. And that's when there's a word in one language that looks kind of the same in another language. And that's nice when you're traveling or when you're trying to work in translation. There's common languages, common words. And there's a lot of those. That's right. Oliver?
What was the cognates? Is that what it was?
Cognate, C-O-G-N-A-T. Cognate means a word that comes into another language that looks like the original language. And so there's a lot of those. We have a lot of those kinds of words, like physician. We know that's a doctor, but physician comes from the Greek word physis, which means life or body, okay, the physical part, the physis. And so we get a lot of those kinds of words. All right, good. All right, now the 10 documents in the Book of Concord. I said there's 10 different documents. there are three names we use for them. And the first thing we will have in this document are called creeds. C-R-E-E-D-S, creeds. And you guys know about creeds from church, right? So in a church on a Sunday morning, we say a creed. What are some of the creeds that you're used to hearing?
The Apostles' Creed.
The Apostles' Creed, Hadley.
Nicene Creed.
Nicene Creed, good. And then there's one more. Titus?
Athanasian.
The Athanasian Creed. All right, good. So the first kind of documents are called creeds. The Latin word credo, which is C-R-E-D-O, and that's your next blank. So behind number one, you should have written creeds. And in the blank, the Latin word credo, C-R-E-D, means, Titus?
I believe.
That's correct. Credo means I believe. Okay? So the Latin word credo means I believe. So why do you think we got this name creed for this kind of a document? Yeah, Oliver.
Well, because if when a creed takes the Latin root from credo, when you say a creed, you're confessing what you know. You're confessing that you believe in Jesus.
That's right. What you know and what you believe. Very good.
Why didn't they just keep it Roman and Latin and call it credo the whole time?
Well, because it's nice to be able to put it into English, and even creed is kind of a form of credo anyway. But you're right. And if you look in a Latin document, it would call it a credo. Now, what's interesting is the reason we call it creed or credo is because in Latin, when I say the Apostles' Creed, what's the very first thing I say? Credo. I believe. I believe in God the Father Almighty. So a lot of the names we have for things in the church are really just from the first words in the Latin phrase. So for example, in the worship service, like when sometimes we'll say the Agnus Dei, right? We'll sing that right before communion. Well, where did we get that name? That's because Agnus Dei is Lamb of God in Latin. And so if you're going to sing in Latin, it would be Agnus Dei instead of Lamb of God, Agnus Dei. And so that's where the name comes from. That's where it comes from. Same thing with Kyrie, because Kyrie means Lord, means Lord. Kyrie, Lord, and Kyrie eleison means Lord, have mercy. And when we sing, Lord, have mercy upon us. So that's why it's called a Kyrie. All we do is we name it for the very first word that happens. Hadley.
We have learned Latin, and when a lot of the things like the creeds and the church things have special words that only go in those in Latin.
That's right. They don't work real well in English. They're better off in Latin. You're right. Translation is always a tricky thing. All right. So that's the first kind of documents. We call them creeds. Another kind of document in here is called sometimes confessions. We already talked about that because that was on the title page. Confessions. So C-O-N-F-E-S-S-I-O-N-S. And I told you already, this is important here, the Greek word, now you can write it down here in your right blank, homologeo. So now you can all get it written down. I gave it to Titus before, I'll give it to you again. H-O-M-O-L-O-G-E-O. Homologeo. And what that means is say the same thing. Say the same thing. You have your hand raised, Jude?
Oh, how do you spell it in Greek?
Well, in Greek, it would be omicron, mu, omicron, lambda, omicron, gamma, epsilon, omega, with a rough breathing over the first omicron. Homologeo. Okay? So homologeo, and that means to say the same thing as. So when a robber gets caught and he confesses to the police that he was the robber, is that a confession? What's he saying the same thing as? He's agreeing with the charge. You did this. Yes, I admit it. I did it. So he's saying the same thing as. He's agreeing. And when we confess in church, the Apostles' Creed, we're saying the same thing as the church has been teaching. We're saying the same thing as what God has taught us. And so when we confess, the big point of a confession is that we are agreeing with what the church has taught. Even more importantly, we're agreeing with what God has taught us. Go ahead, Hadley.
Oliver printed out the Latin translation for the Apostles' Creed.
Oh,
and
good.
It starts with credo.
Yep, that's what I said. And I saw your next words were credo in patrem. I believe in the Father.
Just
Right?
so happens that I had it.
Okay,
For
real
something in history.
good. Good. Titus?
What are the one? Why is it? What is this? They are called. Why do you have that there?
Oh, they are called, the first thing they are called is creeds. So in other words, they is referring back to the 10 documents. The 10 documents are called creeds and confessions. And then there's a third thing they're sometimes called, all right? And that's the number 3. And this one you probably not heard of before, but it's a word that shows up a lot in the Book of Concord, and that's the word symbols. 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 And this is not CYMBALS. Because if it was CYMBALS, what would that be? Titus?
The things on a drum.
The things on a drum, the percussion, those things that go, ksh, those are symbols, all right? But we're not talking about that. We're talking about SYMBOLS, symbols. So what's a symbol? You know this word. Go ahead, Titus or Jude.
Symbol means like something that stands for something else.
That's right. Something that stands in for something else. Now, in the confessions, and this is especially true in Luther's day, and the confessors, a lot of the reformers who are working on writing these documents, they like to call these symbols, because what symbol literally means, it comes from a Greek word again. Symbol literally means to throw together or to put together. Oh, I see you found your hand raiser thing, Hadley. That's great, Oliver. Good. So symbol means to put together. So what we mean then is that we're putting together a sign with a teaching. So in other words, these words on this page stand for a great big teaching. So the Apostles' Creed can be called a symbol of the Christian faith in the sense that it's like a trademark almost. Hadley, you have a question?
That's what the hand was for.
Yes, I see. Go ahead.
When we say symbols, does that mean that we're saying that this stands for this and it shouldn't stand for anything else?
That's kind of the idea. That's right. So it's a symbol, doesn't mean it's fake or any kind of pretend. What it means is it stands for something even more. So for example, if you're driving down the highway on vacation and you see a sign with no words, but you see 2 big golden arches, what do you know that means? Jude?
McDonald's.
McDonald's, that's right. Why? Because those 2 golden arches remind you, oh, McDonald's. That's a symbol for McDonald's. Go ahead, guys. Hadley.
Papa, when we've got the 3 things that are in the Book of Concord, does that mean that there's not just like 1 of the 3 of the creeds, 1 of the confessions, and like
Not exactly. That's a good question, Oliver. In other words, it's not like we have some are creeds, some are confessions, and some are symbols. Okay. In fact, all 10 documents are symbols. Okay. Or trademarks or representations of the whole teaching of the church. So all of them are symbols. And in a sense, you could say that all 10 are also confessions, because even the Apostles' Creed is a confession of our faith. Like we'll even say that in church. Let's confess our faith using the Apostles' Creed. But in a sense, you could argue that all 10 are also creeds, but usually we say creed only for the very short documents, the first 3 documents in the Book of Concord, which happen to be the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasian Creed. But we'll get to that more in just a second. Go ahead, Hadley, you have a question?
Yes, what is the Greek translation for symbols?
What is the Greek translation? The Greek word is symbol. It's symbol. It's sigma, upsilon, mu, beta, omicron, lambda. Symbol, literally. And so this is a cognate for you, Oliver. This is this cognate because the Greek word is symbol, and it comes into English as symbol. It's a cognate. It came straight in English from Greek without any change. That happens a lot. All right. So I want you to now look at your book of Concord, and let's move past. We're at you got the table of contents page. See, they're on page 5, Roman numeral 5. See that? So
Yes.
the table of contents says forward, abbreviations, editor's introduction, title page, preface, and now it says the 3 ecumenical creeds. See that?
Yes.
All right. What page is that on?
Not page
19.
19.
Let's go to page 19.
Disappear.
Page 19. Because on page 19, we have the first of the symbols, the first of the confessions of the Book of Concord. This is the first of the 10 documents. The first thing you notice in that page is there's a little introduction from the editors. Who are the editors? Well, that's Robert Kolb and Timothy Wenger. So they wrote a little note here telling you about the creeds a little bit. And then the very next thing is we get a little introduction to the Apostles' Creed, an introduction to the Nicene Creed, and then a short introduction to the Athanasian Creed. All right. So that's on page 19, 20, and 21. And then finally, it says the 3 chief creeds. And then we have the very first creed, which is the Apostles' Creed. And you'll see on page 21 where it finally says, I believe in God the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. All right. See that? So this is the creed we say every Sunday. All right. And then go to the next page on page 22. And you notice there it says the second confession. This means the second confession of the Book of Concord. And what is it?
The Nicene Creed.
The Nicene Creed. Then go to the next page, 23. It says the third confession. And which is this one?
The Athanasian Creed.
The Athanasian Creed. And those are the first 3 documents in the Book of Concord. And that takes us to page 25. All right. So those are the first of the 10 documents, and only took 3 pages to get those done. So if we had 3 whole documents in 3 pages, that means most of the other documents must be a lot longer, right? And they are. Some of them are very long. Some of them are not so long, and they vary a lot in how long they are. But these are the first 3. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Good. I think we'll stop here because next time we'll start looking at a little more carefully at each of the 3 creeds. All right. And so that's what we'll do next week. And so we're going to work some more on lesson sheet number 1 next week, and we'll finish up the bottom half of it. Okay.
Okay.
We'll fill out the little chart where we've got the 3 creeds, who, when, and why. And we got that for all 3 creeds. Okay. So we'll work on filling that chart out next week. What I want you to do for homework. Okay. Here's homework. I didn't write it down, so I want you to pay attention. I want you to read the introduction to the 3 creeds that were written by the editors. Now, this won't be real easy because this is written at a college level. So it's going to be kind of a lot of big words and maybe a little complicated, but it's not too long. So it's only 2.5 pages that I want you to read. And I want you to read it because I want you to get a little taste of what it's like to read at a college level in the Book of Concord, okay? So I want you to get a little taste of this. And remember, the people who wrote this in 1999 or somewhere in there, only 20-some years ago. And it was one of my friends, Dr. Kolb, and one of his friends, Timothy Wenger. They're the ones who wrote this. So I want you to read the introductions to the creed, okay? So page 19, 20, and 21. Now you notice also there are footnotes. Have you learned about footnotes yet?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so you'll see at the very end of the first paragraph on page 19, you see that little number 2? That means footnote number 2. Look at the bottom of the page. You'll see another little number 2, and then it gives you an explanation. A similar creedal order may also be found in the small called articles. So that's what footnotes are for. You can glance at the footnotes. Don't worry if not everything makes sense. Don't worry if you don't understand everything. A lot of stuff you won't understand, not because the words are so hard. Even if you know what the words mean, you still might not understand it. That's okay. Just kind of read through it and get a feel for how it works, okay?
Okay.
All right, good. You got another question, Titus or Jude?
Yes. What are the small called documents?
Well, that's part of the things you're not going to understand yet. We'll talk about it more later. But the small call to articles are one of the 10 documents, okay? And we'll look more at those more next week. All right, now that's the one assignment I have for you. I want you to read pages 19, 20, and 21, and that should be enough for this week, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
All right, good?
Yes.
All right, we'll see you back next Thursday afternoon for our second lesson together, okay?
Okay.
Okay.
All right, you
bye.
guys have a good day. Have fun
Thank
with the
you.
breakfast, Oliver and Hadley.
Bye. Bye.
All right, bye-bye.